Hello and welcome back to the War of Ideas podcast. As you can tell by the title, most of this podcast will be about electability. And what does electability mean? Does it exist? Is it in our imaginations? Before even talking about something like electability and how much it actually matters, it really isn't a big deal when you compare it to a much higher priority and an easier problem to fix, which is being able to vote in the first place. I'm recording this a few days after the Super Tuesday results, and once again, seems to happen every time there's voting being done. There's video evidence of people waiting in line for hours. How is this not the number one priority of every person in the country to make sure people who want to vote get to vote? We're not even talking about the people who choose to stay home. We're talking about people who want to vote and they still can't vote. It's nice and easy to just say, well, one person, one vote, you have your chance to vote just like everybody else. You know, that's a democracy. We live in a democracy. And besides all of the fact that people with tons of money have more influence, and what advertisements do, and how people convince each other, and what's considered cheating and what isn't, at the very base level, before you even get into thinking about all that stuff, people should be able to actually fill in the circle or press the button that lets them pick who they want. Population density in Texas should be accounted for. Population density everywhere should be accounted for. If there's a lot of people who live in your city, there should be more voting booths. Let's say your polling site is your nearest elementary school. The number of elementary schools nearby matters. The number of workers at those voting sites matter. The number of parking spaces at the elementary school matters. The number of public transportation options to the school matters. The number of voting booths at the actual school matters. The number of bathrooms available at the school matters. And this is ignoring problems like gerrymandering and voter disenfranchisement and the fact that election day isn't a holiday. This is ignoring that, and that stuff matters a lot. The first thing we should be fixing are long voting lines. Turn more schools into voting sites, have more people working there, have more voting booths there, have more bathrooms. So I just wanted to mention that because obviously something like that is more important than arguing about an abstract idea like electability. People have to actually be able to vote in the first place for electability to mean anything, for democracy to mean anything. And short disclaimer number 2, I'll be talking more about human psychology than politics in this episode, but maybe not that much more, because you're definitely going to see a Bernie bias. Just letting you know now, in case you, for some reason, did not expect it. Okay, first, what is game theory? Here's a nice TED video that will explain game theory in a way that we can use as an analogy to how people think about electability.
Given a range of integers from 0 to 100, guess the whole number closest to 2/3 of the average of all numbers guessed. So if the average of all guesses is 60, the correct guess will be 40. What number do you think was the correct guess at 2/3 of the average? Let's see if we can try and reason our way to the answer. This game is played under conditions known to game theorists as common knowledge. Not only does every player have the same information, they also know that everyone else does, and that everyone else knows that everyone else does, and so on, infinitely. Now, the highest possible average would occur if every person guessed 100. In that case, 2/3 of the average would be 66.66. Since everyone can figure this out, it wouldn't make sense to guess anything higher than 67. If everyone playing comes to this same conclusion, no one will guess higher than 67. Now 67 is the new highest possible average, so no reasonable guess should be higher than 2/3 of that, which is 44. This logic can be extended further and further. With each step, the highest possible logical answer keeps getting smaller, so it would seem sensible to guess the lowest number possible. People, as it turns out, either aren't perfectly rational or don't expect each other to be perfectly rational. Or perhaps it's some combination of the two. When this game is played in real-world settings, the average tends to be somewhere between 20 and 35. Danish newspaper Politiken ran the game with over 19,000 readers participating, resulting in an average of roughly 22, making the correct answer 14. For our audience, the average was 31.3, so if you guessed 21 as 2/3 of the average, well done.
Okay, so let's explain how that game relates to picking a candidate for president. Guessing which number to pick in that situation is like guessing who is most electable. You have to take into account what other people are thinking. You have to predict what they're going to do, knowing that everyone around you, including yourself, has the same information, and everyone knows that they have the same information. And you try to basically out rationalize your neighbors. And you wonder, is my neighbor going to try and out rationalize me? If he does, then I should go 2 steps up on that ladder and out rationalize him. So some people will play that game instead of voting their conscience. That can change who they vote for. Like, oh, hey, I agree with Elizabeth Warren about her head tax, but I don't think other people will vote for her because she's a woman. I will happily vote for a woman, but I don't think my neighbor will. So if I vote for her, it's just a waste of a vote because she's not going to win because my neighbor will not vote for a woman. And so you have this cascading effect where much less people vote for a woman, even though many of them would happily vote for one. Bringing that to the number game, it's like saying, you know what, I really like the number 50, but in order for me to win the game, I have to vote for the number 20 because I know the other people voting with me are not going to pick number 50. They're going to go much lower because they think everyone else is going to go lower. So no one is actually free to pick number 50. So there's a nice article I read on 538 by Maggie Coworth that I will link in the description, where she writes, political scientists study electability, but electability ain't no science. Instead, researchers say it's basically a layer of ex post facto rationalization that we slather over a stack of psychological biases, media influence, and self-fulfilling poll prophecies. It's not bullshit exactly. Some people really are more likely to be elected than others, but the reasons behind it and the ability to make assumptions based on it, well, and then she includes a quote by Nicole Bauer a professor of political communication at Louisiana State University, where she says electability is this vague, floppy concept. We don't know who is electable until someone is elected, end quote. And then Maggie goes on, when voters talk about whether Bernie Sanders is electable, they aren't really talking about their own feelings. They're talking about what they think other people feel, which is where polls come in. But polls can become a bit of an Ouroboros, and she doesn't explain it in the article, so I'll explain it for a second. Sort of like a mythical snake creature shaped like a circle where the snake is eating its own tail. So that's basically it. So there's your analogy. Polls can become a bit of an Ouroboros. She goes on to write about a 2014 study finding that candidates who were behind in the polls were rated less favorably by voters, and voters were less interested in seeking out information about those candidates. In a 2018 study, the share of voters who, after reading a candidate's defense of their own electability, were willing to think the candidate could win the election more than doubled, rising from 15% to nearly 34%. So, okay, back to me speaking now. What does that mean? What the 2014 study? If you're behind in the polls, and this makes perfect sense, voters are going to think you are less electable because you're behind in the polls. They then become less interested in finding out information about you, which leads to an Ouroboros, snake eating its tail, self-fulfilling prophecy effect, where those candidates fall even further behind in the polls because less people care about them because they think, oh, they're behind in the polls, this person is a lost cause. People might say to themselves, okay, there has to be some reason why this person's polling at 2% and these other people are polling at 30%. I don't even have to look into that 2%'s platform because odds are the person at 30% is there for a reason. They're probably better. And on top of that, even if I like the 2% person better, they're not going to win anyway. So I'm not even going to bother learning about them. And back to Maggie and her article. A June 2019 Ipsos poll, for example, found that 74% of Democrats and independents said they'd be comfortable voting for a female president, but only 33% of those same people believed their neighbors would be as open-minded. 74% of Democrats and independents are totally fine voting for a woman for president. But 33% of those 74% of people, so that's 1/3 of everyone who is comfortable voting for a woman president, said they don't think their neighbors would vote for a woman president. 1/3. That's a lot. And here's another example that I thought of. You can make the same argument about a gay president, like Pete Buttigieg. You can say, oh, I'd vote for a gay person, but I don't think my neighbor will, so I won't vote for him because I think my neighbors would vote for Trump over Pete. So I don't want him going against Trump because I think everyone else is a bigot, and therefore I don't want gay people going against Trump because they will lose. So you can take out gay, insert female, take out female, insert old, take out old, insert Jewish, anything you want. Same logic. But key point here, doesn't just apply to identity. It applies to policies too. These are hypothetical percentages coming. Let's say 74% of people say they're comfortable voting for a candidate who wants Medicare for all, but 33%, 1/3 of those same people, believe that their neighbors wouldn't, so instead they vote for someone else. So the electability bias is always in favor of the status quo. It always comes back to the center, to what we have now, because any deviation from that, people are going to say, oh no, I'm okay with that, but I don't know if my neighbor's okay with a deviation from the mean, so I'm going to vote for the mean because I think that has a better chance of winning. When I talk about the center, I'm not talking about what's most popular with the people, what the people want. I'm talking about what we already have now, which is not in line with what the people want. But the people will vote in favor of what we already have instead of what they want because of electability, because of over-rationalization. This is the snake eating its own tail. Everybody is trying to out-game theory their neighbors and assume who these people are okay with voting for. It is a perfect example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Let's compare this to our initial game theory explanation. I'll just play that part again for you, because I'm bad at explaining it.
Given a range of integers from 0 to 100, guess the whole number closest to 2/3 of the average of all numbers guessed. So if the average of all guesses is 60, the correct guess will be 40. Now, the highest possible average would occur if every person guessed 100. In that case, 2/3 of the average would be 66.66. Since everyone can figure this out, it wouldn't make sense to guess anything higher than 67. If everyone playing comes to this same conclusion, no one will guess higher than 67. Now 67 is the new highest possible average, so no reasonable guess should be higher than 2/3 of that, which is 44. This logic can be extended further and further. With each step, the highest possible logical answer keeps getting smaller.
So comparing that number problem to an election, the closer we get to 0, the closer we get to the status quo. Guessing 0 is voting for no change, because you have the least confidence in your neighbors for voting their own conscience. Even though it's a fair comparison, the goal of the number game, guessing the right number, is not the same goal we have for electing people to become president. The entire purpose of the number game is to guess what your neighbor's gonna do. And the better you are at that, the more likely you are to win the game. But in politics, in picking a president, if you carried the same goal over from the number game, the goal of picking a person to run for president is to just pick the winner. But that's not the goal of primaries or of general elections or of any election. Nobody's goal should be to pick the winner of the election. The goal should be to pick the person you want to win the election. Yet some people vote as if the goal was to pick the winner. And I'll admit, in a primary, the goal sort of does skew a little bit towards the goal of picking the eventual winner. That's where the electability argument comes from. You want to put the person forward that you think will get the most votes from people in Michigan and Pennsylvania and Florida, because right now those are the only states that matter, sadly. So of course, when it comes to a primary, you do want to pick the winner that will win the general. You do want to predict what your neighbor's going to do in the next stage of the process. But that's not how the game should be played. It's an ineffective way to play the game. You don't win anything if you pick the person that can beat your opponent, but you still don't like the person you picked. You don't win. And once again, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If nobody played by those rules of electability and predicting what their neighbor's going to do, then the person with the highest electability is the person who the most people like and the most people will vote for. The person that people like the most is the most likely to win the game. Now, you might be thinking, wow, that sounds like a lot of psychological stuff that we can't really prevent people from thinking about when they make their decision. But there actually is a really good solution. Not perfect, but ranked choice voting would go a long way to help our problem of electability. You can vote your conscience and not have to worry about your vote being wasted because your neighbor doesn't like women. So if you think your neighbor doesn't like women, you vote for Elizabeth Warren as your first choice, and then you vote for Joe Biden as your second choice, because you have no faith in your fellow Americans, and you think they're all going to pick Joe Biden, and you think he has the best chance to beat Trump, so he's your second choice. If your intuitions about your neighbor are true, and Elizabeth doesn't end up getting more votes than Biden, your number 2 vote for Biden will help him stay above the rest of the field. And if your intuitions are false, and more people are ready for a woman president than you thought, Elizabeth Warren will win, and your vote will have helped her win. Her electability is higher than you thought, and she has the highest electability, because you're able to vote your conscience, and you can see what happens and who gets picked when everyone votes their conscience and doesn't have to worry about guarding against their ignorant neighbors. But unfortunately, there are still going to be plenty of people out there who go, oh my god, if everyone puts Elizabeth Warren number 1 and Joe Biden number 2, and we actually put Elizabeth Warren up against Trump, we're gonna lose, because the general election will not have ranked choice voting. So people are gonna use their same psychology, and they're still not gonna vote for a woman, or they're still not gonna vote for a gay person. But there are literally no downsides to having ranked choice voting. It can only make things better or keep them the same. I do not understand why this wasn't implemented 200 years ago. And also, let's talk about other things we can do. Well, what about, and this is something I'm actually not sure of myself, it's the right thing in theory to do, but I have been convinced that in practice it is not a good idea. And that is hiding polls. Not just polls, but hiding vote counts for every state in the primary, and then just announcing who won once all the states have voted. And this is ignoring the fact that there will be a lot more people doubting the results of the vote if it just comes out of thin air at the very end of the primary with no incremental updates along the way, which make it more believable. So this is just assuming everyone will be able to trust the results that gets announced at the end of the process. That way, Iowa wouldn't have an effect on the voters of New Hampshire. The vote in New Hampshire would not have an effect on the voters in Nevada, because people vote for the person who is the front runner. It's just human nature. You see the person's name in the news more because they won, and then people say they have momentum, and then you believe they have momentum, and then it makes you vote for them if you didn't know who you were voting for before. So imagine if we didn't know who was in the lead. Nobody dropped out. We had our 10 candidates, and everyone just voted for who they liked the best. Just if you think about that for just a minute, you can imagine how many more people would be voting for someone like Amy Klobuchar or Andrew Yang. You really can. But the second you see Tulsi Gabbard has 1% of the vote in Iowa, no one in Nevada or New Hampshire is going to vote for her because they think it's a waste of a vote. Not because they don't like her, but because they think it's a waste of a vote. And they're right when it comes down to someone who's polling at 1%. And this would happen even with ranked choice voting. To a lesser degree, ranked choice voting would help. There's be a lot more people voting for Tulsi Gabbard or Marianne Williamson, fully knowing that these two people have less than 1% of the vote. They would just put those people as number one, and then they would put, their pragmatic choice as number two. And knowing polling and voting information before you yourself vote can also work the other way. It doesn't always suffocate the people who are polling below 5%. It can also hurt the leader if they have a big enough lead. If the candidate you like is winning by 20 percentage points, you might not vote when it comes to your state because you think they're going to win anyway, so why bother leaving my house? And that sort of thinking has changed the outcome of elections in the past. When we have a state that's won by 0.3 percentage points by Bernie or Biden, like let's say Maine, that was the closest state so far, where even if the delegate count is the same, which means nobody actually won, the person who wins by 0.3% in the popular vote, they get media attention, they get momentum. Why? Why should winning a state by 0.3 percentage points give you a boost? Winning by 30 percentage points shouldn't give you a boost either. There should be no such thing as momentum in a primary, but there is, because hey, we're only human. So hiding polling and previous states' votes, I think, in theory, would be a really good idea. Ranked choice voting and hiding polling. But here's a rebuttal and why I said I'm not sure what I would want to do back when I first started talking about whether we should hide polls or not. When asked about hiding polls and previous vote totals, Nate Silver has said, without polling, there's a vacuum filled by punditry and media assumptions. Banning polls doesn't necessarily mean people vote smarter. In fact, it means they're likely to vote even dumber, basing a choice on speculation instead of data. And a professor of quantitative social science at the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom, Todd Hartman, has said, people will use whatever information is available to them. In an ideal democracy, we'd like to see people making decisions based on the issue platforms, but we also know that many voters are low information voters, and they're going to use whatever cues they can to sort out which candidate to vote for. Those might be endorsements, it might be party affiliation, it might be poll results. In that sense, bandwagons aren't exactly good or bad. They just exist. That's what has convinced me that hiding polls may not be such a good idea. People will be voting based on different metrics, and a lot of people still might not vote based on the issues and which issues they agree most with. So there could be lots of chaos if all people have to go on is what the media thinks. They're going to be a lot more swayed by the media if they have no polls to choose from. The polls show them what the people are thinking. If they have no polls and they want to find out information or other people's opinions instead of just their neighbors, and they can't find national opinions, they're going to go on TV and they're going to see someone talking about, oh, I like this person because they do this, this, and this, and they're more likely to be swayed by the guy on TV. And it becomes a popularity contest of the most popular TV pundit will convince the people who to vote for. And I'll admit, in a way, that sort of still happens. Probably at the very, very beginning of when the primary process starts. We have a default choice. Joe Biden, the default choice. It's not about who enters the ring first. It's name recognition. It's media coverage. And that might be the biggest factor in initial polls. Because you can't rely on every person doing their research and voting for who they like the most. They might turn on the TV right after someone was just finished explaining Tulsi Gabbard's platform and everything she stands for, so they miss that because the TV wasn't on, and then they have the channel on right when someone's explaining Elizabeth Warren's platform, and they go, wow, that sounds good to me. And then they go and change the channel again, and they miss everything else, and they just vote for the person that they heard about the most on TV. Polls kind of give people another angle of information, and they see, oh well, Warren is polling in third place, and she was the only person I saw them talk about on TV. Maybe I should go do some more research of the first two choices and see how they compare to her. So we have a dilemma because there's a lot of low information voters. So I don't know if we should hide polls or not. I don't know if we should hide vote totals from states. I don't know if we should do one or the other instead of doing both. If you have any suggestions, feel free to email them to me. You can email me at podofideas@gmail.com. And here's Maggie Coworth again in another 538.com article. As hard as it may be for some of us to imagine, laws limiting when opinion polls can be published before an election are pretty common. Of the 216 countries whose election rules are tracked by the United Nations-backed Electoral Knowledge Network, 92 have some kind of regulated blackout period where polls cannot be published. Even after its 2002 rule change, France still has a 24-hour blackout period before the vote. Experts say most of these laws are based around the same premise: polls can influence votes. If you know that most of your fellow citizens are planning to pick a specific candidate, you might decide to be part of the winning team. If you know the person you'd pick is so far ahead that there's no chance of them losing, maybe you'll chill out and stay home on election day. You don't want people making choices in elections based on the kind of herding behavior that leads to a mediocre restaurant having a line down the block for no reason other than that there's always a line there. Sometimes popularity isn't actually a proxy for quality. Let me repeat that again. Sometimes popularity isn't actually a proxy for quality. Now, let's take a look at the ways electability is manifesting itself in this primary. What kind of role is it playing? Well, let's take a look at some of the exit polls from Super Tuesday. We can easily see how electability makes people vote against their own interests. For voters whose priority was beating Trump, 37% of those people voted for Biden compared to 25% voting for Bernie. For people who voted for a candidate who they agreed on the issues with, Biden got 24% of those voters, and Bernie got 44% of those voters. And of those two choices in priority, whether you think beating Trump was more important or agreeing with the candidate on the issues was more important, beating Trump got 62% of people saying that was the most important thing, and agreeing on the issues got 35% for people saying that was the most important thing. And honestly, I think this paints the best picture. What is electability in this situation if not beating Trump? Those two things are synonymous with each other. So this all comes back to game theory. We're talking about 62% of people compared to 35%. That's a huge difference. We're talking almost 2/3 of people thinking that electability is more important, and the other 1/3 think the person who's going to enact the policies that I like is the most important. I just don't get it. You're saying you're going to vote for a guy who you don't agree with on policy, at least as much as someone else, just because it means your team will win? And presumably, the moderate is more electable than the far lefty Bernie, but why would you call Bernie the radical when he's the one who is more in line with the opinion of a majority of the people than Joe Biden is? A majority of people want Medicare for all. A majority of people want legalized marijuana. So how is advocating for those majority positions radical? Advocating against what the people want is radical. If you're going to decide what's radical and what isn't based on the current laws we have in place now, then freeing slaves was radical. Allowing women to vote was radical. Besides voting for someone who wants as little change as possible, not even being a good idea in the first place, which we've seen with John Kerry and Hillary Clinton in the past. I mean, Obama won because people were excited and enthusiastic about him and thought he was going to change the game. So not only is that not a good strategy, in my opinion, and a lot of other people's opinions, but how dumb a plan is that even if you do win, let's say you do win, and your guy wins because he was the electability candidate, and so he was able to beat Donald Trump. What happens when your guy gets in the White House? Then what? You're still not going to get the policy you want because you voted for someone that you don't agree with on the issues. Are you someone that supports the legalization of marijuana and wants Medicare for all, but you decide that you're going to vote for Biden because you think he has a better chance of winning? It's like, okay, and if he does win, you're not gonna get marijuana legalized. You're not gonna get Medicare for all. Sure, it's a step up from keeping children in cages and tax cuts on the rich, but you could have just voted for the guy that's going to do more of the things that you want instead. Let's look at another exit poll. In 16 states that have had Democratic primaries so far, every single one of them were in favor of replacing private health insurance. I mean, the closest it got was in Alabama with 49% to 45%. 49 in favor of replacing private health insurance. This is also a badly worded exit poll question. Medicare for all polls better when you don't include anything about eliminating private health insurance. But in this poll, they did talk about eliminating private health insurance, and it still got a majority in every single state. Texas, 63% to 33%. Maine, 71% to 26%. So this is the worst that Medicare for All is going to perform in a poll. So even Maine, where over 70% of people want to replace private health insurance, Biden won. I haven't seen an exit poll about legalizing marijuana, but I'm pretty sure at a national poll that's been done a million times, the American people are massively in favor of it, and that includes Republicans. So what are these people in Maine and everywhere else thinking when they say yes to that exit poll and they want private health insurance eliminated, and then they vote for Biden? The only explanation is that they think Biden is more likely to beat Trump. By definition of you liking his healthcare policy less than Bernie, by definition, that means he's less likely to beat Trump. Stop thinking about your neighbors and vote for who you agree with. Your neighbors are a lot more like you than you think, even the Republican ones. Especially on healthcare. Especially on healthcare. Or maybe your position on it is, hey, I want to eliminate private health insurance, but I don't think it's going to happen, so I'm going to vote for the person that doesn't want it in the first place. Once again, that also doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? I mean, Joe Biden said it himself. This is America. There isn't a single thing we can't do. I mean, what is the government besides a giant union for the American people? What's the point of having them if you can't even get the things you want? If they're not going to do the things that you want them to do? Or at least fight for what you want? The president is your employee. He's not the boss. You're his boss. You put him there, or her. You put the president there, and you can take them out. That is how we need to look at the government. They are our employees. We are the employers. If they're not doing our bidding, we fire them. The people want someone who promises change, and that's on both sides. Trump won because he promised to do a million different things. Joe Biden literally told a group of wealthy donors no one's standard of living would change. Nothing would fundamentally change. Is that what people think is going to be Trump? I've seen a great Martin Luther King quote making its rounds on the internet recently, and I think the people who have been bringing it up are right when they compare Joe Biden's candidacy to the white moderate that Martin Luther King talks about. So here's the quote. First, I must confess that over the past few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. That's Martin Luther King. I mean, I know I'm biased, but who popped into your head after I read that? Who do you picture as the white moderate, who's more devoted to order than to justice, who talks about uniting the country and being civil and making sure the mean tweets stop, instead of talking about why we're divided in the first place? Instead of telling people to cheer up, give them a reason to cheer up. I hope all the people who are over the age of 65 and voting for Joe Biden read that quote. And hey, I mean, it makes a little sense. There's less people over the age of 65 that are in poverty than there are young people, thanks to Social Security and Medicare. So it makes sense they don't want anything to fundamentally change there, or they're more okay with nothing fundamentally changing. They're not struggling as much. Hey, I don't care if marijuana is legalized. I don't do it. I'm 70 years old. I'm never gonna do it. Well, in response to that thought process, let me just tell you this. A society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. It's pretty crazy that working millennials are contributing to the Social Security paychecks of people who already have more money than they do. Not to go on an anti-Social Security rant, because it's done great work lifting seniors out of poverty, but that is obviously contributing to seniors voting for Biden over Bernie and viewing wealth inequality as not a huge deal. And if you're one of those people that oppose socialism or social programs and you're voting for Biden, it's kind of hypocritical if you think about who is actually benefiting the most from the social programs we have now. Seniors like the social programs they have now with Social Security and Medicare, but they don't want more social programs, even though these are two of the most popular programs in the history of America. It's okay for them to get Medicare and Social Security, but not for everyone else in society to get it. As if it devalues what they have because it won't be unique to them anymore and it'll be given to everyone. And it's the same mentality of the people who don't want to cancel student debt because they just paid off their student debt and it wouldn't be fair to them. And I understand how awful that would feel. I really do. I myself did not take out a loan for college. I was lucky enough to get a scholarship, and to see someone who has $50,000 in debt just get it canceled, and to think, oh, I guess I should have done what they did because I went to a lesser known and lesser renowned school than they did, specifically so I wouldn't have to go into student debt, and now it was all a waste. So yeah, I understand that, but you still That's still not a good enough reason to say no. It just isn't. Saying other people should suffer because you did is not a valid excuse. Saying young people shouldn't get Medicare because you didn't when you were younger is not a valid excuse. Should we never try to better our society because that would make all the old people feel like they missed out? I'm sorry, but that's just not how the world works. Should we not have made a polio vaccine because it's not fair to the people who died of polio? George Washington never got to use an iPhone, and he never got to watch Breaking Bad. So here's the exit polls on age from Super Tuesday. Here's how voters age 65 and over voted. 50% voted for Biden, 18% voted for Bloomberg, and then Sanders came in at 15%. That's how badly seniors are destroying Bernie Sanders. And these are the people who benefit the most from socialism. And Medicare is popular. It's not like seniors think it's terrible. They love it. In a survey of over 2,000 people with Medicare, 75% of people said they are very satisfied or satisfied with their Medicare coverage. 6% said they're either dissatisfied or very dissatisfied. So these are the people that are voting to make sure no one under 65 can get Medicare. They're voting to keep it exclusive, so only they can have it. And you know what happened to healthcare stocks the day after Super Tuesday? Every single one of them rose 10%. 10%. And you know what electability's sidekick is? Pragmatism. Those two go hand in hand. Here's the great John Delaney endorsing Joe Biden. He made a statement where he said, Joe understands that we make progress through pragmatism and reaching across the aisle when possible, and that yelling the loudest or having the most extreme opinions doesn't actually accomplish any goals. You could have fooled me, because it kind of looks like the Trump administration is yelling the loudest and has the most extreme opinions, and they're accomplishing a lot of their goals. And you know what? He has a 90% approval rating among Republicans. We had pragmatism with Obama for 8 years, where we didn't have full control like Trump does, where he had to agree to everything the Republicans wanted on his Obamacare. Remember when Mitch McConnell didn't let Obama nominate a new Supreme Court justice, even though he was still going to be president for the next year? And do you have any idea how many Republicans love him because he shafted Obama and allowed Trump to elect a Supreme Court justice instead? When you have to come to an agreement between two sides who want the complete opposite from each other, they will only agree on doing nothing. The people don't win. You know what's really going to get the Democrats fired up? You campaign as president and you tell them, when we win the House, the Senate, and the presidency, we're going to give everyone health care, even Republicans, and there's nothing they can do about it. Because we're the ones in charge now. Do you have any idea how happy every Democrat would be if they heard their president say that? When I say every Democrat, I'm not talking about Hillary Clinton. I'm talking about the people. Only people who don't really care if anything actually changes care about being pragmatic. Because when you're pragmatic, everything slows down to a crawl and you get nothing of substance done. Try being pragmatic with a bear who doesn't understand English and wants to rip your face off. Or don't be pragmatic and get what you and your constituents want done. I wonder which strategy I'm going to pick. Watching everyone coalesce behind Biden reminds me of the emperor has no clothes. It's like everyone knows he's naked. They know he's suffering from Alzheimer's, but they just pretend he isn't. And when Trump, the 4-year-old child, is the only person pointing out that he's naked, a lot of voters are going to be on his side because he's telling the truth. They all think the same thing that Trump is thinking. They all see it, but he's the only one that is going to say it. Well, at least he's the only one with a platform that's going to say it. And the leaders of the Democratic Party are going to yell that pointing out Biden isn't wearing any clothes on stage is a low blow and very mean, ignoring the fact that it's true. If I were them, I could at least go at it from an angle of, I know he's lost a major step, but his VP pick and his cabinet positions will do good work and work for good policies. He can sort of just be the figurehead. He doesn't actually have to do anything as long as he hires the right people. That's actually a point that I would be fine with. But no, no one wants to even say that because nobody can say the emperor has no clothes or they'll be outed. We got Kamala, we got Cory Booker, we got John Delaney. All these people who didn't even have to endorse anyone. They go and make a fool of themselves and say, yep, I'm with this guy. Coming from someone who just spent an hour ripping on electability, it's still crazy to me that people listen to Joe Biden for 5 minutes and then have the audacity to say he's the most electable candidate. The Democratic Party is just going to have to hope that swing voters don't care that Joe Biden can't put a coherent sentence together. And he better pick a good VP. Alright, that's gonna do it for today. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.